Okay, so welcome everyone. Once again, this is a presentation of the Lost First Monday Grief Speaker Series. Jessica Mead will be our presenter this evening. We're very thrilled that she's agreed to do this presentation for us again. I'm going to be switching back and forth trying to do the slides, but Debbie and I will both sort of be monitoring the chat if anybody's got questions. And so with that, I will go ahead and let Jessica do her introductions, and I'll go ahead and start the screen share.
Great. Well, thanks, Emily. And thank you everyone for coming tonight. I hope that you can leave with something tangible or an interesting thought at the very least. And feel free to ask me any sort of questions throughout the presentation. You can put them in the chat, I think is what Emily's instructions were. So, and again, forgive me if there's any background noise on my end. I have 3 young kids and a dog, and it can get quite noisy here. So I apologize in advance. So my name is Jessica Mead, and I am a social worker. I work for the LOST program. I've been with the LOST program for about 12 years. So right now I work for LOST in a part-time therapy role. I run the young adult group, and I also have some individual clients that I see. So I am very interested in grief in young adults, mostly from my own experience as a young adult who is grieving. So I'm also a survivor. I lost my dad to suicide in 2005. So it's been a little while for me, but my experience as a griever really sort of got me curious about this particular developmental stage, and sort of curious about some of the things that are happening that sort of make grief a little bit different. So that's what I'm going to be going through with you tonight. All right, so next slide. And I have my notes here to my right. So if you see me look to my right, that's what I'm looking at. All right, so suicide bereavement groups. So as many of you know, Catholic Charities started the LOST program in 1979. And as you can imagine, in the late 70s, a group for survivors of suicide through Catholic Charities was pretty cutting edge for its time. And in 1979, there were only 3 support groups that existed nationwide. So LOST started groups. They started by meeting weekly, and then they expanded to monthly groups and individual counseling. So that had already been going on. So I came to the LOST program in 2010 and was helping with some of the groups and really helping to organize some of the program. And also I'm coming with my own grief experience. So in 2010, Debbie and I were working together, and we were noticing that like a lot of the monthly groups didn't have a lot of younger people in them. So we were sort of curious, like, where are all of the young people? Because we were seeing them for individual counseling. They just didn't happen to be in a lot of the groups when we were running some of the data. So after talking with a lot of young survivors, we realized that it really was sort of a separate thing that a lot of people were dealing with as young people. So in 2012, we started the LOST Young Adult Group, and it's been running strong since 2012. So 10 years, yes. And we have a really good attendance, and people really benefit from it. So I'm glad that that is also an offering of the LOST program. Next slide. So some of you might be wondering, who are emerging adults or young adults? The language we use sort of interchangeably, emerging adults and young adults. And really, it's this age period between 18 to 25. We started looking through the literature to sort of understand what we were seeing in the support groups. So we narratively knew that people were saying like, oh, we don't feel like we fit in. We feel like we're dealing with something different, but didn't quite know if that was the case before turning to the literature. So Jeffrey James Arnett, he actually created most of the literature on emerging adults. And if you were to do like a Google Scholar search, you'd see most of the topics come up with his name that he's authored. So he's sort of like the forefront person in literature related to emerging adults, but really it's a separate developmental category, just as childhood, adolescence, early adulthood, late adulthood. It just hasn't been recognized as such because the literature has taken a little bit longer to catch up with it. So back in 2004, some people were finding that the social brain was actually not developed as they thought it should be by like early 20s. A lot of legislation and law has to do with like turning 18 and being an adult. But really what we know now is that the brain isn't actually fully formed socially and relationally until like the late 20s. So that coupled with just ideas of adulthood changing within the last 50 years has made this become a more prominent sort of category to look into. We know that identity development shifts to later 20s. So after college, when you're really deciding what you want to do with your career, when you're finding people that you want to be in intimate relationships with. And some of this is a generational shift. So, you know, like my parents had very different experiences in their 20s than I did. So I think that, you know, this idea of emerging adulthood is, you know, something that we've been talking about, I would say, within the last like 20 years or so. So if it sounds new to you, it might be new to you. Just some interesting facts. So like in 1970, the median age to marry for men was 23. And now actually this research was from 2020, but in 2020, it was 29. So 23 in the 1970s for men to marry, now 29, and women, it was 21, and now it's 27. There's just so much more of an emphasis on investing in careers, schools. It's much more achievement based than say 50 years ago. All right, so next slide. So some key concepts of emerging adulthood are this idea that it's future oriented, but with a focus on building social relationships. So people in this age category want some depth to their social interactions. They want deeper connections than they did as adolescents. And there's 5 characteristics of emerging adulthood. So this idea of identity exploration in areas of work, love, and worldview. This idea of instability. So Arnett noticed that there was a lot of just instability in the lives of emerging adulthood. So not a stable place to live, not really longstanding relationships. A lot of that has to do with you know, going to school, coming back home, going to different areas of the country or the world to work, making new sets of friends, like changing where you are. The next characteristic is the focus on the self. So in this age range, people are really focused on self-development and self-exploration. So as an outsider, it might seem, you know, sort of, I don't know, selfish, I guess, or self-centered, and possibly to the eyes of the griever, but really it's actually a characteristic of this developmental period that, like, in order to succeed this developmental stage, there sort of has to be an inward focus on the self, an inward self-exploration. So another key concept was feeling in between. So people in this age range sort of feel like, well, I'm not really an adult yet, but I'm not a kid. So like I have different expectations about how I want to be treated, but I'm not fully an adult yet. And I need my parents and I need like the grownups around me to help me through some things. So people sometimes can talk about feeling like a little confused or stuck. And then the last characteristic is possibilities. So just this idea that like anything can happen. The door is open to whatever someone is interested in doing. They're not sort of stuck in one place. They don't have a ton of responsibilities yet that keep them stuck in a place. So it's sort of just an interesting developmental period, to say the least. So these concepts really helped me to understand how the grief played out in a lot of the groups that we were doing. So by going back to the literature and really sort of understanding what normal emerging adulthood development looked like, really helped conceptualize some of the things that we were seeing in the groups. Next slide. So some general characteristics of healthy suicide bereavement. So these are just some concepts that we sort of came up with after sitting around and talking and really just sort of thinking about what people do when they're coming to our office or coming to our groups. One thing that we know, it's a general unfolding of longing and sadness, sitting in sadness. So a lot of times I'll talk to my clients about like leaning into the sadness and really just sort of like almost letting yourself like sit in like the midst of some sort of awful storm and just being still in it. We also know that people with a strong sense of self, people that have stability and have had previous healthy coping tend to do better with the grief process. We know that people get through the grief process by using the supports of others. So people that have a strong support network to rely on have, we believe, a healthier grief process. And healthy suicide bereavement really requires a focus on the past to make meaning. So we're using a lot of our past history with our loved one, or even just our past history ourselves to sort of make meaning and understand what just happened and understand the meaning of our loss. All right, next slide. So this is just a little chart. So I already talked about the 5 characteristics of emerging adulthood, and then I just talked about the general grief process. So just take a few seconds to read that over and just sort of notice anything. I'll be quiet for a minute. So as we were sort of conceptualizing the literature with what we were seeing in groups and what we were doing when we were working with people, and for me, thinking about my own grief experience, they really sort of like don't mesh well. So general grief, what we think is healthy, and the characteristics of emerging adulthood. So we labeled these things competing demands. So it's almost like 2 things at once that are working against each other. And eventually like one of them is going to be like pushed to the side and one of them is going to continue on. But it's just interesting being able to see sort of that, I don't know what the right word I'm trying to say is, that just that really challenging grief. Yeah, maybe it'll make more sense when I keep going. The next slide. All right, so how does grief compete with emerging adults? So we labeled that healthy suicide bereavement was future oriented. I'm sorry, we labeled that a normal developmental milestone of emerging adulthood was being future oriented. And then as opposed to the healthy bereavement process, grief really requires a focus on the past, a focus on understanding past relationships. Emerging adults often live in transition, as we spoke about, and grief really requires some stability, some stable ground to be really sitting in sadness and grieving. A lot of emerging adults don't really have a consolidated sense of self. Most identity formation happens between the ages of 18 to 25. So if you know some young adults, or if you're a young adult yourself, really think about that. So I think that we often think that, you know, at ages 18, 19, 20, if we have 18, 19, 20-year-olds around, that like they should have it together, they should have it figured out, they should know what they want to do. But really, I would even say like on the later end of that, when I worked with my young adult clients, that the identity formation really sort of happens in the, I would say, mid to later 20s. And grief is really hard when you're also working to figure out who you are. So you don't have a sense of your sort of worldview. You don't have a sense of a clear sense of direction yet, but you're also trying to figure out and maneuver, this terrible loss through just like a rocky ground underneath you. Emerging adults report more conflict in peer and romantic relationships. So if you can remember back to your early 20s, or if you're in your early 20s versus noticing, other people in other developmental stages, you could probably agree with this, that a lot of people struggle with peer relationships and romantic relationships, especially in grief. We talk about it in our groups all the time, that people, probably all grievers, but I'll say specifically grievers in this age range, tend to not really have people that they can talk about the loss with. A lot of 18 to 25-year-olds haven't really had a traumatic loss yet. So there's maybe someone that doesn't quite understand, or that doesn't really have the tolerance to sort of sit in it with you. So, and then the second half of that is that grief just requires support. So in order to maneuver suicide bereavement, I definitely think that it requires a really solid sense of relational support. Emerging adults tend to be more angry. That's what some of the literature that I was reading about was: disillusioned, self-centered, and use alcohol and report more isolation. And this just doesn't work for grief. So it tends to be, it can be, I think, in a lot of emerging adults' life, sort of a toxic time in their life, when they're not getting along with friends. They're using alcohol either socially or to cope. They're not getting along with friends, so they report more isolation. So all of these things are sort of competing with the normal unfolding grief process. All right, next slide. So some themes that we came up with were from our groups and then from the literature. So we'll call them emerging adult grief themes. So we were noticing that individuals were either putting their grief on hold and continuing on their developmental track. So they were sort of like not dealing with the grief, pushing it aside, being quite avoidant, because they had to graduate. They had to take these tests to become this profession. They had to just get through, power through to get married. Or sort of the flip side of that was that there was an inability to meet these milestones in their assumed time frame, which also caused sort of issues like embarrassment and guilt and not keeping up with peers. So that's what we were sort of noticing, like for a lot of people, one of these two separate areas, either putting their grief on hold and just sort of continuing on and almost using that as just an avoidance tactic that they sort of had to use, or not being able to do those things because they were consumed with their grief. And then relationship issues were almost always present. So people coming to the groups were reporting not feeling connected to friends. Maybe they were in a romantic relationship and it ended, or they just like couldn't even date because it just wasn't something that they could do right now. And then the last one is just general emotional instability and unhealthy coping were often present in the group. Okay, next slide. So I'm just going to go through some examples, and we will have Emily in a couple of slides share her grief story as well, just to sort of put some stories to some of the ideas that we're talking about. So in terms of the themes, so this idea of individuals reporting, putting their grief on hold and continuing on their developmental track. So there was a young European man named Sam who would come to the groups. He was 25 when he started coming, and his brother died when he was 20 years old. His brother was very ill, and he had had a psychotic break prior to his dying. And he was told by his family not to talk about it. They weren't allowed to talk about it. It was not acceptable to talk about it. And this really impacted his entire identity development. He was living in a foreign country when he moved here, and he told himself not to think about it. And he threw himself into his studies. He successfully completed a higher education degree, but he really had no consolidated sense of who he was. And he would actually come to the groups and really, he would talk about almost like feeling like a shell of a body, and didn't really know what sort of things he believed in. He didn't know what he wanted. He didn't know really who he was at all. So 5 years later, he came to a group on a whim, and then just sort of threw himself into his grief process, because he knew that that was sort of at the core of him sort of feeling like a shell and not understanding himself. He needed to understand his brother, how his brother died, his relationship and context to his brother and his death. And he really did that. He threw himself into all of the groups that we had, individual counseling. And he used all of the groups every time that he was in a group. And he did okay. So he sort of paused his grief. His grief was on hold for about 5 years. Once he graduated with his degree is when he sort of threw himself into his grief process. I think he spent probably a couple of years in our groups, and he eventually went on for a PhD somewhere and had a better idea of what he wanted to do. And he went into sort of a different career. So he went into the mental health field because he realized how important that was to him, and to understanding his brother. So it was just really interesting. But we get a lot of people coming back to the young adult group whose typically it's parent, sibling, friend, who died many years in the past. So we've had a few people come to the group who've lost parents as small children, and we're told that, this isn't something we talk about in our house. And then they, get to college and they can't figure out why a lot of relationships aren't working. They can't connect with anyone. And again, sort of dive into some of the grief related themes and understand those in order to sort of understand themselves and their worldview. I think that was it for that. The only other thing I was going to mention too is that a lot of times, and I think people report this sort of globally in the loss program, just feeling guilty. Sam talked a lot about like feeling guilty that he was moving on, even after he had spent a lot of time sitting in his grief process, but feeling like almost like he didn't deserve it, or he still needed to be punished somehow by his brother's death. So we're often sort of dealing with that in the group too, just feelings of guilt in regards to completing these developmental tasks. All right, next slide. So this is sort of the opposite scenario. So this is the second theme that we were talking about, the theme where individuals reported an inability to meet milestones in their assumed time frame. So I'll talk about Amy. Amy was another client who came to the loss group. So she was 19 when she started coming, and she had also lost a sibling who she was very close with. And they were best friends. So sadness and grief just completely consumed her. She also sort of had some comorbid depression going on as well. And she was unable to continue on with her school. So she was 19, I think she was a sophomore in college. So she had been going for like 3 semesters or something like that. And she wasn't able to continue. She had to drop out of school. That fueled her depression. So she met for individual counseling in the group for about 1.5 years. She also was referred to a psychiatrist who started her on some medications, but just really, again, taking that time out to really confront her grief issues, sitting in her grief issues. Although she wasn't able to graduate with her peers and sort of do things in the assumed time frame, she eventually did maneuver through to not only sort of understand herself in the context of her grief, but also in her career. So she went back to school later. She got a business degree, and I think that she's doing okay now. All right, next slide. So as you can see, there's this sort of like developmental conundrum. So there's these parts of development that have to happen in order to develop and be on a healthy developmental tract. And then there's these grief things that also need to be happening at the same time in order to maneuver through the grief process and sort of successfully, journey through. So some patterns that I mentioned before were attending years after the loss. So for myself, so my dad died when I was 20, and I couldn't even talk about it until I was probably 25. So anytime that I even the idea of it came up, I would just start crying. Like I wasn't able to be around friends. And I was sort of one of the people, I think, in the first scenario where it was like, well, can't handle this right now. I have to graduate college. I have to, sort of do all these things. And also, re-grieving at future milestones. So I got married, and it was, I can't even think right now, 10 years after he died. And it was still like a very sad time that just brought up a lot of stuff. So marriages and babies, all of those things sort of re-trigger a lot of the grieving for emerging adults. Okay. So next slide. So it says Drew's story, but it should say Emily's story here. So I will turn it over to Emily to talk a little bit about her grief.
Thanks, Jessica, and thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this too, and to talk about this a little bit. When Jessica first sort of brought these emerging adult grief themes, certainly I can find myself in every single one of them. But this was the issues in terms of relationships was one that just really stuck out for me. So I lost my older brother Joel in 2014. I was 26 and he was 28. So I had already gotten past a few of those major things that Jessica was talking about in the previous slides. I was done with college. I was done with grad school, but I was still very much in that process of identity formation, and still very much trying to figure out who I was, what I wanted, sort of what my future would bring. I am fortunate to be able to say that my brother was not only my sibling, he was my best friend too. I am so thankful that our relationship developed in the way that it did, but it also added, I think, some complications after he was gone, because I now, have missed for 8 years the person who I could reminisce with, the person who shares so many of my foundational memories with me, and he's not here. And so there was a part of my sort of identity formation that was trying to figure out, who am I when he's not here? And did these things really happen to me if I have no one to check them with, if I don't have anybody to sort of, hold that foundation for me? I was very, very, very lucky because my mom, who is on here somewhere, I often say that she was sort of my grief partner through a lot of things. She and I are very similar in a lot of ways, probably that social work background, but she and I were just a little more open and outward and talking about our experiences, which isn't the case in a lot of families and wasn't the case with every family member in ours. But I think in a lot of ways, when I experienced my loss, I felt simultaneously very, very young and very, very old. It was a very strange sort of thing to feel at the same time. I wanted to be with my parents. I wanted to be with my family. I wanted to be with people who I knew cared for me, but also with people who knew my brother and who loved my brother and who had that shared experience. And I also felt so old in terms of just like, why have I experienced something that feels so out of the timeline, right? That like, I know that people lose their siblings. I know that people have these losses, but this wasn't supposed to happen to me right now. You know, this wasn't supposed to be something that I was dealing with at 26. And I think that I have some of the most wonderful friendships that I've had for many, many years. But it became really apparent to me that not everybody was going to be able to handle this, and that not everybody was going to be able to offer me support in the way that I needed support. I thankfully was able to maintain many of my relationships, and they're people that I can still, you know, rely on today and can call anytime. And unfortunately, there were friendships that I just couldn't put the effort into anymore because it wasn't being reciprocated back to me and the way that I needed. And I remember one time in particular, I'd met up with two of my very best friends from college. And this was probably 2 or 3 months after I lost my brother. And they didn't even ask me how I was, almost just like completely not bringing up the issue at all. And there's a part of that, sure, that they could have been worried they were going to offend me or, you know, whatever. But that felt so hurtful to think that I had just gone through something that was so foundational for me and was so heartbreaking. And they just couldn't get there. I thankfully have had the loss program to help me, you know, work out some of that. I had a wonderful friendship, unfortunately, with a colleague who had also lost her brother. And it didn't matter that she was, you know, 25 years older than me, because that was where the bond was. And that was where I really felt the care and the compassion and the understanding. And so, you know, I've been able to not hold a grudge, you know, against the people who couldn't offer me support. That's very true. But it's also made me cautious when I form new relationships, whether that's a friendship or, you know, maybe even someone I want to date, whatever that is, needing to trust that this is something that I can speak about openly, that they can understand what the weight of that was, the impact of that, and that they're sort of willing to share that piece of my life, that piece of my history, because it's still something that's just so big for me. And so I just, you know, again, like so many of these themes that you've been highlighting, Jessica, I think are just so true. And I think, you know, I think that the difficult, like you just said in here, the difficulties and communications is just so true. So many people just don't have the language to talk about this, whether that's, you know, in your 50s or your 60s or your 70s. It's just really, really difficult sometimes. And so to find a group of people who can really sort of stick by you and not shy away, I think is really crucial. But there were certainly times when I felt very lonely in my grief. But, you know, the one thing I will say, and I don't want to take up too much time because I feel like I've been rambling, but the one thing I do think though, and this is something that I really think is really important, is that it's made me more likely to reach out to my friends when they're going through a hard time. So unfortunately, several of them have experienced loss, not to suicide necessarily, but have lost parents unexpectedly or have lost friends. And I find that I have to have a comfort with that because I felt so hurt when people didn't have that with me. So that's one thing that I certainly try to do, is to put that forward. But yeah, looking back on all of these things, I certainly see these themes in my own grief story. So I thank you for allowing me to share. Thanks, Jessica.
Thanks, Emily. Thank you for sharing your story. It takes courage, especially with your mom on the line too. So thank you. So I think that, as I was listening to Emily speak, I was thinking of this idea of like this sort of lack of maturity, and this idea of being self-centered on both ends. So as you know, as you're a griever, you're self-centered for reasons beyond development. You're self-centered because all you can think about is the sadness and the longing and the person who died. And it's very, very hard to go beyond that, especially in the very beginning. And sort of developmentally too, it just doesn't work in a lot of peer relationships because that's sort of a core piece of the development is just this idea of being self-centered, like wanting to do what you want to do, doing your own things. So it is really tricky to find someone that just really gets it and really can sort of sit in it with you. So in terms of like romantic partnerships, a lot of times, and this is probably for all different types of losses, not just in the emerging adult category, but death often highlights dysfunction in romantic relationships, which then cause a lot of difficulties in communication, not only like day-to-day communication, but communication around the grief. Sometimes, and Emily, I think you hinted at it too, like I wanted someone to ask me how I was doing that day. And then other times in the group, we'll have people say, and can you believe on my first day, someone said this to me at work and it made me think about that. So I think that sometimes all survivors are different. And sometimes we don't even know what we want. Like one day we may want someone to spontaneously ask us because that's just what we need. And other days we're like, oh, I hope I don't see someone at the grocery store that I have to talk about this with. So I think that another thing within romantic relationships is the idea of alcohol. A lot of people coming to the group are using alcohol socially or even beyond socially, and other drugs as well, which I think also can complicate relationships. The unhealthy coping leads to just more toxicity in romantic relationships and in peer relationships. And dating is an issue too. So a lot of people in the group talk about like not really knowing how to date if they hadn't been in a relationship prior to the loss, and not really sure how to bring up the topic of, the person who passed away, and just sort of avoid dating altogether for a while until it feels more comfortable, I guess. Okay, next slide. So another relationship that becomes impacted is parental relationships. So emerging adults no longer see themselves as adolescents. I spoke about this earlier, but they also don't see themselves as adults. So to any parents out there who are parenting young adults, it's really tricky because it's sort of in this gray area. And I think that a lot of emerging adults are still financially dependent on their parents, but also don't feel like they need to, sort of go by the same rules and things like that they did when they were adolescents. So I think that in and of itself, without the grief issue, can cause some conflict in the parent-child relationships. But when there is a sibling loss, so when the young adult has lost a sibling, we often do hear a lot of anger at parents for not being able to parent them anymore. And I probably in the parent group, there's parents who are expressing some frustration about, while they're grieving, their other child is becoming even more needy. So I think that this is also an issue that just impacts parent-child relationships too. And it's a tricky one to maneuver. All right, next slide. And then the last relationship I'll talk about is peer relationships. So in emerging adulthood, so we know in adolescence that peers are so important. They're like the most important relationships that children report having in adolescence. But same with emerging adulthood. So emerging adults also really rely on their peers, and they're sort of a foundational and really important part of their life. But they expect more complexity and emotional depth, which I think that depending on where you are in that like 18 to 25 age range, you might find more or less of that at the lower or higher end. But it's interesting that, emerging adults sort of report their peers as just as important as teenagers. So with that, a lot of emerging adults report a lot of disappointment in their friend circles in our group. So a lot of people that come to the group talk about like really liking the group because it's a time when they can connect about the loss, because they just can't do it in their friend circles. No one wants to be around it. Like people want to be out having fun or studying or, doing whatever sort of is normal. And they don't want to be often like sitting in someone else's sadness. So it's really hard, I think, to find friends in this age range who are willing to sort of unconditionally support the griever. And social normacy is still important while grieving. So it all becomes really tricky. And it's really nice that we have the group so that people can really put a lot of these really complicated issues out and be able to talk about them, because I don't really know if there's much of a place for it outside of the group. Okay, next slide. So the last theme is this idea of emotional instability and unhealthy coping. So for a normal emerging adulthood development, one without a traumatic loss, there's this idea of instability sort of already there. So on top of that, you put a traumatic loss, and on top of instability becomes more instability. So oftentimes emotional instability. And as we touched on, in the last couple of slides, this idea of unhealthy coping, often in the forms of alcohol and drug use. So Mary Kate is one of our facilitators, and she shares her story about using drugs and alcohol after her brother died. Since she's not here, I'm not going to paraphrase her story, but I'm going to tell the story of a different person that I used to work with in the loss program, and her name was Rebecca. And I changed all the names. So as I'm saying that, I should say, actually, there is some anonymity. So any like identifying characteristic in any of the stories we've shared, except for Emily's, we've changed the names and the relationships around. So I will call this individual Rebecca. And when she's 23, she came to see me after her mom died. So 2 years after her mom died is when she started to see me, and it had just been 2 years of just a lot of toxicity in her life, police involvement, blow-ups. And at the point that she came to see me, she told someone that she wanted to die. So it was sort of like a very crisis-related time that she was first coming to a therapist. She really, really struggled with emotional stability. So this idea of emotional instability was really present. And on top of that, she was using a lot of drugs and a lot of alcohol. So she would go out with these friends that she was using drugs and alcohol with, and that, she had met in various stages of her life, often get into fights, being kicked out of bars, police involvement again, yelling and screaming. She had a boyfriend at the time that didn't work out. They broke up. And she would enter into these like shame cycles. She would get really, really drunk and then feel really, really bad and ashamed, and feel really ashamed the next couple of days that, she was using drugs. And I should say, Sandy Beck is here. So hi, Sandy. Thanks for letting me know about Mary Kate. I'm sad she's not here tonight, but Mary Kate is in Tampa now. She's one of our facilitators, and she is doing a comedy show tonight, so she wasn't able to share her story, but I could share parts of her story too. So Mary Kate's mom was giving me permission to share Mary Kate's story, so thank you. So we spent most of, to go back to Rebecca, her sessions, just sort of focusing at first just on regulating her. She was so dysregulated that it was sort of impossible to touch on some of the grief stuff that eventually needed to be touched on. But I was constantly assessing her levels of drugging and drinking, and educating her about harm reduction approaches, and also trying really hard not to use drugs and alcohol as an avoidance tool. And we sort of came to a lot of conclusions that the sadness and the grief was just so intense for her, that she couldn't actually sit in it if she wasn't drinking or using drugs. So she was just a really, I think she's a really sort of interesting case that really highlights a lot of the stuff that's going on in emerging adulthood, but also how the grief just really didn't work for her. It took her 2 years of just really bad relationships, bad grades, to actually sort of understand that she needed to do the grief, but she couldn't actually do the grief until she could really work on some of the emotional regulation stuff first to actually be able to feel sad about her loss. And also Mary Kate, shares a similar story that, so Mary Kate lost her brother, and after her brother died, she was also in college, and she just had a really hard time being around friends. She had a hard time sitting in her grief. She found herself drinking too much and then sort of getting really emotional when she was drinking, which just didn't feel productive. Her family, she used her family a lot to talk about her brother, and her family was really supportive. But it took a while for her to be able to sort of connect with friends and connect to even her brother, without it being just too intense. So personality stability and emotional regulation are actually not stable until mid-20s. So again, like folding in this piece of like normal development, it looks very different, personality stability and emotional regulation to very different 18 to 25-year-olds. But just the fact that it's sort of not fully formed yet, and then sort of folding in this layer of grief, you can see how it just becomes sort of tumultuous for a lot of young people. So another interesting concept too is that young adults often report more anger and contempt. And a lot of people in the young adult group express a lot of anger at the person who died, which I do think is sort of a bit of a difference from some of the other loss groups that we have. So that's often something that, we do talk about in the young adult group. So in our group also, we talk a lot about alcohol and other substances. So it is a part of sort of what we discuss in the groups. And for those of you that have been to a loss group before, we do not abide by guideline number 7, I think it is, the one about swearing, because, swearing seems to be the common language through which many of the young adults in our groups sort of understand one another and are relating to one another. So just sort of a unique thing about our group. But one thing about drinking is that for a lot of emerging adults outside, again, of the grief process, binge drinking peaks at 21. So binge drinking on top of intense traumatic loss, you can see how that could become not quite the healthiest coping mechanism. And it becomes an avoidance tool. So people, keep it together all week and then go out drinking with their friends, and, just sort of break down after like a long night of drinking, which again, isn't the most productive way to sort of express grief. All right, next slide. Okay, so these are just some recommended interventions that we came up with at the loss program. So we obviously have been promoting our group. We think it's a really nice place for emerging adults to feel heard. It's pretty well attended. So I know that sometimes people are worried that there won't be enough people there to sort of like hide if they feel like hiding. There is usually, I would say, at least like 10 to 12 people there each month. And I do think the virtual setting has changed some of that. Like people can, not talk, and it isn't sort of, a strange dynamic in the group. Individual counseling. So I would say for most emerging adults, I probably would recommend individual counseling really to work on the concepts of the identity development. That is harder to touch on in the group process. In the group, we're doing a lot of normalizing and a lot of connecting, but to really work through the identity formation and identity development and how it is incorporated into your loss, I would recommend individual counseling. And then just some clinical themes that like we'll talk to, we've talked to other professionals about too, is just we normalize the grief experience, obviously. We give psychoeducation about healthy relationships and assertive communication. I have worked with a few young people where there are, there is some domestic violence going on. So we're just really working on, what a healthy relationship looks like, what assertive communication looks like. Teaching coping to feel pain and avoid distraction. So other ways of avoiding pain would be like video games or binge watching 27 shows on Netflix in an evening. And so just coming up with a specific plan for the grief process. We had one person in our group who she would identify herself as like type A personality, and she actually would schedule an hour with herself every Friday night. And she really sort of used this time to look at pictures, write letters, like do all of these really healthy grief techniques, I would say, because it was too hard for her to sort of like incorporate it into her week without having this like hard start and hard stop. So I always think that was a really interesting way to make sure that she that the client used to make sure that she wasn't completely avoiding her grief, but also sort of continuing on and sort of doing well in her work week. Another recommended intervention, because it comes up so much in the group and in individual counseling, is also substance abuse counseling. So either like a grief counselor who also has a focus on substance abuse, or at least a therapist that can help identify and sort of work through with possibly some harm reduction techniques in mind as well. Okay. Next slide. So I'm not sure how long the presentation is supposed to be, but I feel like we're kind of flying through this tonight. This is my last slide.
Okay.
Is that okay? Was it
We
supposed
don't
to be
have an
hour?
end point, it's meant to be, you get your point across. Maybe people have questions, conversation. That's all fine. No pressure.
Okay. I thought it was an hour and a half. So good to know. Thank you. So just some points, some takeaway points that, I thought were just important to reiterate. We want to understand suicide grief through a developmental lens. By understanding suicide grief through a developmental lens, we can help to normalize the experience for the client and the family system. So I have a lot of parents come to me and say, my 22-year-old son will not talk about the grief. We try and sit down with him. He will not do it. I say he needs to go to counseling. He is just bottling all this stuff up. And, I'll talk to parents about just, it takes sometimes some young adults longer than adults or even children because of everything we talked about tonight, because of this developmental conundrum and needing to almost like the griever needs to, in that moment, sort of prioritize what they want to be focusing on, because it's really hard to focus on both. So, sometimes that does look like, okay, I'm taking a semester off school and I'm, staying home with my parents, or it looks like I'm powering through, I'm taking 18 hours and I will figure this out later. And both are right. Neither is wrong. And they both, work out. And people that come to the groups in people that don't come to the groups, I'm sure too. Most people are okay. And most people that we come into contact with eventually are okay. And they eventually figure out their own process and their own way to sort of maneuver their grief and sadness. But we think that by understanding the grief of emerging adults through a developmental lens, it just creates a more positive meaning making for the client. So when we can talk to the young adult group about like, hey, this is hard for you because of this and this and this, sometimes it's like, oh God, that is so helpful to know. I thought that I was, doing it wrong, or I thought that like this was just really hard for me. But it's just really hard. And one thing, I touched on this a second ago, but one thing that I would say to the parents of emerging adults is that your child will figure out their process and it can't be pushed. Most people meet their milestones and most people go on to be successful. We have definitely seen it. So the biggest, takeaway there, I would say, is that like it really can't be pushed. So with anything in your child's life, which I'm sure you have figured out, if your child is now, between the ages of 18 and 25, is that like a lot of things they have to figure out on their own, and grief is probably just the same as those other things. It can't be something that someone's forced into. And if any of you have read The Body Keeps a Score, it's a book on trauma by Bessel van der Kolk, you will know that like the mind actually cannot be forced to deal with trauma when it's not ready. It could actually be sort of detrimental. So really the person has to have an ability to regulate. They have to have that strong foundation that they're sort of maneuvering from in order to sort of do the grief process as well. And then one thing I would say to emerging adults is that it may feel isolating and lonely, but it helps to connect with others who understand. And now we have an ability to connect anywhere. So we have people from all over the country coming to our group, which is really quite cool. It's a time of instability and a time of some really big feelings. It does level out. So you do become more stable. Your feelings become less intense, but it's a process. But in that process, you may learn a thing or two about yourself, which is pretty cool. And I think that is it. Yeah. And these are just my resources that I use to create the presentation. Does anybody have any questions?
Yes, if anyone does have a question or a comment, feel free to either use the chat, or if you're comfortable unmuting yourself, feel free to just talk to Jessica directly. With either one is fine.
Debbie or Cindy, anything to add that I missed out on?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I am a mom of a 20, I think 26, 27. And you kind of touched up on my question. I'm going through the grieving as well. It's been only 7 months since my daughter passed. And my oldest, she was 16, the one that passed. My oldest is a young adult. So I talk to her every so often, but I have been lately preoccupied or worry a little bit about her in regards to, she doesn't talk much about what's going on. And the other day, when I said, hey, her birthday is coming up, what do you think we should plan? She kind of answered back in a way that was kind of, and not angry at me, but at the whole thing. Like, I effing haven't, think about it. I am still this and that. She doesn't even want to barely come to the house yet. And so I hear you saying, give up the space, they'll figure it out. But also as a mom who just lost one daughter, it's like, do you keep knocking at the door, especially if you're hurting too? And you think, one of the things that I've said to her is like, hey, we're family, we're hurting, this not the same, but the same person. And maybe we can do something together. So I guess it's very individual, but I wanted to hear your perspective on how to go about it. I don't want to push too much, but I don't want to let go so much that she thinks that I'm not interested or worry about her.
Yeah. Oh, it's so hard. It's you're just towing such a fine line. And I think that what you're talking about is something that so many parents and so many young adults from the other perspective, talk about in the groups. This idea of anger. A lot of young adults are really angry with their parents. I think that a couple of reasons. I think that one, just sort of as we learned in the literature, just more anger is present in young adulthood due to this like inability to regulate big feelings, kind of like teenagers. It's a little bit easier to understand because they're younger, but like teenagers get really angry at their parents, and it's almost like more acceptable. It's sort of like that, just drawn out a little bit more. So there's just more anger in general. A lot of times when it's the sibling of the young adult who died, they are just, their parents are their lightning rods for their anger in general. They're angry that their parents are grieving and that they're sad all the time. They're angry that this happened. I think that sort of the anger to me in that relationship means that it's a safe enough relationship to be really angry in. So this idea that like there is this, it sounds like you guys do have this dynamic. You want your daughter to remain close to you because you've already lost a daughter, and this daughter is sort of getting mad and pulling away. So I guess all I can say to that is that I feel like that's something that we talk about all the time in the loss program. Even outside of the grief issue, you have a really good sense of your relationship to your daughter, your surviving daughter. And when it's too much, and when, it might not be too much, and you sort of take each other's lead. And eventually it may shift. And if it was, I guess, my child, I would, keep offering in that sort of way that it sounds like you already are, but just knowing that it might be met with a bit of resistance too for a while.
Yeah. And, other times, most of the time, she takes her time to come back at me. But she say, hey, I'm doing well. I'm just being very busy. I'm okay. It was just that day that she was. So it's not that she's completely mad, but maybe I just got her in the wrong time. Mm-hmm. And, but I am at this point right now, at the point where I'm like, okay, maybe I should not contact her or send her any text and just wait until she wants to communicate. But then I guess I have to tell her that, because then my fear is like, I don't want her to think that I don't care whatever she's going through because she lives away from me.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good idea. Just sort of communicating like, hey, I hear you. Like, I hear that you don't want me to contact you anymore about this. So I'm going to limit my contacts, but I'm letting you know it's not that I'm not, because I'm not thinking about it still. It's because I'm sort of taking your lead and hearing what you're saying.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
And there, I see Mary Jane has her hand raised, so I'll get to you in 1 second, because there was a question that just asked about why perhaps young adults do express more anger, and I think you sort of covered that a little bit. I didn't know if you had anything else to add.
There was one research article that I remember reading that sort of spoke a lot about, just, again, this was outside of the context of grief, just that like young adults tended to be have more reported more feelings of anger and contempt than like any other age range in this particular study. So I don't know exactly why that is, other than sort of all of the things that we talked about, and just sort of like the competing developmental demands, the continued individuation from parents that was already like really started in adolescence, and just sort of a continuation of that. And then I do think that, for a lot of lost parents that we see, I'm just repeating what I said before, but this idea of like, the parent is like the lightning rod for the anger because they can tolerate it. So like this young adult may not really have any other sense of support around it. And they're not able to break down in those sort of ways with their peer groups, as we talked a lot about already. And in that parental relationship, it can be, you know, a safe place to do that.
Go ahead, Mary Jane. I see that I'm going to lower your hand, but.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So we kind of have a complicated situation. We have grief on top of grief because my husband died in 2005, but it was of natural causes. But Nate was 9 at the time, and his brother who passed. Oh, stop it, Joey. I'm sorry. My dog always starts barking when I'm on the phone.
That's okay.
So anyway, so my son passed away when he was 19. Nate was 21. Okay. And Nate, I think, feels intensely guilty because Ben shot himself with Nate's gun.
Mhm.
And when he got guns in the house, I did not want him to have guns in the house. And I said, I don't want the guns here because you know what Ben is like. I can't believe I said that. It just slipped. I don't know, because I don't know, maybe it was, I don't know what it was, but anyway. So I think, so Nate moved in with his girlfriend about 2 months after Ben passed away. And he really does not like to come here at all to the house because this is where Ben died.
Mhm.
Where I'm going at with this is that he had a really difficult time after my husband died, and he had a lot of anger issues. And so so then Ben dies, okay, and Nate is 21. So he's got another grief issue here, but it's a different kind of grief, of course.
Mhm.
And the counselor that we had seen way back after my husband died said that when children, and I guess I would consider Nate still not really a child, but he was an emerging adult at the time. When they have trauma, they have like an emotional retardation, right? So they don't really mature at a normal rate because of what the trauma does to them. So I think he might have gotten out of some of the grief from losing my husband, although he never really talked about it. And then here comes Ben. So I don't know if his avoidance behavior of the house is because he's kind of reverted back to the emotional grief that he had when my husband died. I don't know where he's at with it, and I know he went to counseling for a little bit, but he stopped, I think, because she was getting too intense with him or something, whatever. But I don't know what to think about it. If he is emotionally kind of like retarded, because he's got another grief issue to deal with the guilt on top of it. And so he's 26 now. He'll be 27 in October. So is he going, other than just the normal grieving process with suicide, is that an issue that you see a lot where they're just not mature because it's retarded because of the grief, because of the suicide, the grief?
Well, a couple of things. I'm so sorry for your loss.
Thank you.
That must be really, really hard. Losing two people so close. But what I'm hearing as you're speaking, and what kind of stuck out at me was this idea of the house, and sort of coming back to the house. And I think that for a lot of people, that does seem to be like a conflictual thing, especially in like the parent versus like child relationships. A lot of times people either really need the house because they are very reminded about their loved one and like feel very connected. And for other people, it can almost be like a trauma response. So like something that they can't even tolerate. So I think that, just something to think about, the actual house maybe being just like too much of a trauma trigger. But on top of that too, I do think you're right that like, there can be this thing called complicated grief and complex grief. So when you have two really significant losses back to back, it can be really, really hard to process and to sort of make sense of all of that. So I
Mhm.
think that other things do get impacted. Sometimes your emotional development does get impacted if you've had some sort of big traumatic loss in the midst of a very important developmental milestone. So I think that, that definitely is a possibility, sort of this idea of like, almost like getting stuck in like a developmental stage. I do think that that's a possibility. And then just this idea of just like grieving two really big losses at such a young age is just really loaded and really intense.
Mhm. Okay. All right, thank you.
Mhm.
Hi, I'm Sandy. I'm gonna say my youngest had, the thing is, it's like she just turned 21. She was literally almost exactly 4 years younger than her brother. And he died a month after his own birthday. It is Mary Kate Beck, for the record, but Mary Kate's birthday was February 8th and her brother's was February 6th. And where am I going with this? They didn't have a birthday party that was really separate. You know, they had family birthday parties between the two of them and my niece, who was also born in February, every single year. Mary Kate blew out Steve's birthday candles to make him mad every single year. So she doesn't mind coming to our house. She doesn't mind. She still loves her old bedroom. But when it came to her birthday, she doesn't want to be here. She doesn't really want to be with us. She doesn't really want, it's all so triggering, honestly, that and then she tells me she doesn't like her birthday. Who doesn't like their birthday, right? But she doesn't like her birthday. And it's like, well, what can I do? And she's like, honestly, Mom, nothing, because what are you going to do? Have a party at the house, right? She and I actually went to Arizona together one year on her birthday, just because she's like, my answer to my birthday is just to get out of Dodge. And is that a healthy response? I have no idea, but I think she's entitled to that. Is that something she'll be stuck on forever? I don't know. But if that's a comfortable way for her to deal with her birthday, so be it. And in terms of young adult responses, when my son died 8 years ago, I literally had 3 young adult daughters, 29, 25, 29, 23, 21. And they were all in different places. For anybody else who's listening, my oldest had a baby the day before my son died. And she was like, I don't have time for any of this, Mom. I have a baby to raise. I have this going on. I have a job. I'm overwhelmed. She basically, we all sort of went to counseling a couple times together, and she was really like, I don't have time for this. Then when she really couldn't get past it without going through it, eventually she went to counseling. It's her journey, but we were always available. And she was really mad at us because she thought we should have seen the signs that we really didn't see. As Steve's parents, we should have known, and we didn't. I didn't like it very much, but I guess she was entitled to those feelings. My next youngest was studying for CPA and spent a lot of time in libraries staring at walls, and then wouldn't talk, didn't want to talk. Then she got totally overwhelmed. My husband literally dragged her to Debbie Major. Still a funny story. She went to that with her arms across her chest. She was literally livid, but ultimately it was a good thing to go. And then you guys know Mary Kate pretty well, so you know her story. But I just wanted to share the birthday thing because, yeah, there are things that are just very triggering, and in the process of working through it, it's just hard. It's just hard. But 8 years later, it's not as hard as it used to be, if that's any comfort.
Thank you, Sandy, for sharing. I feel like you guys are sort of like the perfect sort of segue into this idea that like it's really, really hard when you're in it, and you see a lot of different things with a lot of different children and personalities, but you're kids are all really successful and healthy, you know, and they've all made the grief a part of their life, whether it was in the very beginning or whether it was like 4 years later, whether it was, you know, putting it aside to have a baby or whether it was like confronting it, you know, after a night of drinking or something. So I think that, you know, you bring up a really, really nice, nice topic that like they all made it through.
I am not seeing anything else in the chat. We could stay on a couple more minutes if anybody does have a comment. I also know that you know, we're certainly available for more information and consultation. We can always get you in touch with Jessica if you've got more questions or, you know, something specific is coming up for you.
And I will say one more thing. I'm
Yeah,
so
go
sorry.
ahead.
But I guess the takeaway too is that like the range for normal is quite large. So like there's quite a bit of normalcy. Sandy just said, like, I don't know if that was normal or not when we changed the birthday celebration. Absolutely. Like, I think that is an idea. That's a concept of like maneuvering and pivoting, you know, and figuring out like, this is too much for me right now and I need to do something else. But really like the range of normal is pretty big. Where we step outside the normal range is when it's, you know, self-harm, suicidal ideation, and I would say some pretty serious like substance use. Those would be times outside of that. But, you know, what many of you might be struggling with is like a rockier relationship with your child. And I feel like that is within the range of normal, unfortunately, and something that a lot of parent-child relationships weather as a result of the grief process.
I think that was a very good reminder, Jessica. I think we all need to hear that. That our expressions of grief are normal. That's a important part at any stage, that normalization. So thank you. All right, did we have anyone else who wanted to share? Like I said, we certainly can get you in contact with Jessica or anyone at the Loss program if you've got any further questions for follow-up. We really thank you all for spending some of your Monday evening with us. We will be back again in September, not on the first Monday. That's Labor Day, so on the second Monday. So, you know, just watch your email. We'll be communicating that. And then I'll just ask one more time if there are any other questions or comments. And if not, I think we can wrap it up.
All right. Thank you guys. Thanks for coming.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much. Take care.